And good day, I'm Bob Schieffer in the Washington Bureau of CBS News with Washington Unplugged on the day that we learn of the death of Senator Kennedy. The death of Senator Kennedy, while it was expected, still is a little hard to process because the senator was in Washington and a part of Washington so long it's almost as if he became a part of the landscape. Here to talk about him and some of the things he did in more than nearly 50 years, I would say, in Washington and in the Senate is Tom Oliphant, a former reporter and columnist of the Boston Globe. Tom and I have known each other since the McGovern campaign in 1972, and even then you were covering the Kennedys.
He came along one week, if I seem to recall.
Yeah.
Knowing that there was no hope, he still did the work and came out for a week with it.
Everybody says, well, this was an extraordinary man. I've said it several times myself on television today, who had this uncanny ability to work with his ideological opposites. Why was he so good at that, Tom?
Well, you know, it has to be genetics. You cannot be taught to comfortably reach out to other people. You cannot be taught to care about other people. It's either part of your makeup or it isn't. And there are a lot of things that distinguish the Kennedy brothers that survived World War II anyway. But one thing they all had in common was this inbred concern for others and this inbred love of the game. I mean, President Kennedy famously said that the reason to love politics is it's the way things happen in a democracy. You don't love politics just for the fun of doing deals, though, you know, you do them and we all tell the stories about doing them. But it's a means to an end. And the concern about others, you either have it or you don't, and a lot of it is noblesse oblige. Yeah.
You know, the thing about he could always find the sweet spot in a piece of legislation that somebody who may be totally opposed to some of the things and part of the legislation, he could find that spot that they could agree on. I think of John McCain. He had totally different views on war and peace, and yet they both understood you've got to take care of the troops. And it was Kennedy who found the armor for the Humvees when kids were getting killed in Humvees.
You're exactly right, but and you know, there's another one that put McCain and Kennedy together. Still, today it continues, despite the fact that he died this morning. And that is immigration. I think that part of what distinguishes McCain is an ability to see beyond his party and his ideology, which actually is a defining characteristic of Kennedy that doesn't get noticed as much as it should be. And 3 years ago, these two guys, in the midst of a national shouting match about immigration, put together the architecture for what will be the solution. I mean, it may not happen this year or next year or even the year after, but when it happens, and it inevitably will, it's another one of these Kennedy deals.
It was more than just the ability to see that sweet spot. Ted Kennedy was one of the most informed people in Washington. The thing that always characterized him, his staff was always top flight. He got the best people. He was always the most well briefed. When he sat down at the negotiating table, he knew what he was talking about.
Totally.
You might not agree, but he knew what he was talking about.
It always amazed people who weren't used to dealing with him the first time you're confronted with this primal force, just how prepared he was. You know, the Alumni Society, as they call it in his office, it's scores of people in all sorts of major corners of American life today. And when President Obama made his statement, I was just thinking, you know, it reaches right into the inner circle of the Obama White House. The person who's in charge of domestic policy for President Obama, coordinating all of his stuff, Melody Barnes, comes from Kennedy's senior staff. That was her most recent job. Obama's White House counsel, as sensitive a job as you well know as any in the White House, is held by somebody who's probably as close to Senator Kennedy as anybody still working in. I'm talking about Greg Craig, who was his foreign policy guy in the 1980s. The person who stage managed Justice Sotomayor's confirmation came Stephanie Cutter, who's handling the media stuff on this awful day, comes from Kennedy. I mean, the alumni are everywhere.
Well, in fact, Stephen Breyer, a member of
famous
the Supreme
story.
Court.
You know how Kennedy tells a great story of the moment when he first realized that Breyer would make a pretty good judge. He was working for him then on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they were having one of those, what they call them, committees where the Senate resolves the differences with the House over a piece of legislation. And Breyer is sitting there with him. It's 1979 maybe. And the guy on the House side makes a point. And Breyer kind of listens and nods, says, well, that's an interesting argument. We hadn't thought of that. Maybe we ought to consider that. And Kennedy's thinking, on the one hand, hey, you work for me, don't. But on the other hand, there's that thing they call judicial temperament. And it was shortly thereafter that Kennedy began the backstage moves that landed Breyer on the district court, then on the appeals court, and ultimately on the Supreme Court. And he's just one of scores.
He always was the senator who was willing to do the little extra thing that maybe somebody else was not.
Can I tell a story?
Sure.
There are many. There's scores of them. But, there are probably 10 million relatively poor kids in America today who have health insurance coverage. And the father of the program is Edward Kennedy, but it never would have happened without Republican help.
Yeah.
In fact, equal Republican help. And the guy who helped him was one of the most unlikely converts of all the ones Kennedy worked with down through the decades. And I'm talking about Orrin Hatch of Utah. He had no closer Republican friend. The guy's just broken up today. It's understandable. But when they were talking about children, Kennedy, when he was moving toward closing one of these deals, he would say, and he said to Hatch, I want you to come out to the house. He was living in Virginia at the time. He said, I want you to come out to the house for dinner, and we'll get out my mother's china. Just you and me. And I think he had them at Mother's.
In other words, we're gonna bring out the good stuff.
That's the red carpet. That's what it looked
class.
like.
You're an honored
that's
guest, not just a guest.
And in Hatch's case, it went even beyond that to show you the lengths to which Kennedy would go as a legislator. Hatch's hobby, a lot of people may not know this, he's a songwriter.
Yes.
And I gather the songs are mostly spiritual in nature with a sort of country music in the background. Kennedy didn't just express some interest in that. I think he may be the only politician in America who's heard the whole songbook. And that is what, it's a recognition, Bob, that this business is as much personal as it is political, and that the two mix all the time. And Kennedy just had this way to make you feel like he really cared.
Yeah. I have heard several people have asked me today, will there ever be another Kennedy? And I'm not sure that there will. I mean, no one is indispensable, but when you look at the Senate and how the Senate is put together today, basically a group of development officers. The guy who raised the most money got elected. Obviously, Kennedy's family wealth had a great deal to do with his election.
Absolutely.
But it seems to me there's kind of a different kind of group of people. I don't mean they're bad people, but they're different than they were in Kennedy's day.
And there's also a different tempo to the life. You know this better than I do, Bob, but there really was a time in America, pretty recently, where, elections, off-year and presidential, vigorously contested throughout our history. But then they'd be held, and there'd be a period. Sometimes it'd be a year, sometimes it'd be 14, 15 months, when you understood that governing replaced politics, and you had to accumulate some, accomplishments. And that atmosphere is what I think fostered. I mean, I think the people talk about giants then and maybe not so giant people now. To me, it's the culture that's different. And he was brought up in a culture where once the election's over, you actually try to get something done.
And it was a period when the period of governance was far longer than the period of campaigning.
Precisely.
Now, I think it may be
the opposite. And the window is smaller and smaller and smaller.
Tom Oliphant, a pleasure to have you with us today. Let's look back now at the life of this extraordinary person. They called him the last of the old-line liberals, and he was partisan to the core. But his great zest for politics,
If $20 billion deficits were wrong under the Democrats, then $200 billion deficits are at least as wrong when the Republicans are in power.
And his unique political skills.
How insulting can you be? Make that argument on the floor of the United States Senate.
Caused even those who opposed him to call him one of the most effective legislators who ever walked the Capitol corridor.
Doesn't it, Senator?
Edward Moore Kennedy, Ted as he came to be known, was born in 1932, the last son of the wealthy Kennedy dynasty. When his older brother won the presidency, Massachusetts voters sent 30-year-old Ted Kennedy to finish out JFK's Senate term, and they never let him leave. The new young president and his family brought a glamour to Washington never before seen, but in time the family would seem almost star-crossed. An assassin's bullets brought down John Kennedy. His brother Robert fell to another crazed fanatic. In 1969, Ted Kennedy drove a car off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island. His young companion, Mary Jo Kopechne, died, and for 10 hours, Kennedy failed to report the crash. What happened that night would follow Kennedy for the rest of his life.
This morning I entered a plea of guilty.
Even so, Kennedy's name would be floated as a possible presidential candidate for the next decade. In 1980, he finally ran. He challenged the incumbent Democratic President Jimmy Carter, but he was ill-prepared, and it showed in an interview with CBS News correspondent Roger Mudd.
Why do you want to be president?
Well, were I to make the announcement and to run.
Kennedy never recovered from the rough start, dropped out during the primaries, and never sought the Oval Office again. But back in the Senate, he honed his legislative skills, formed personal alliances with ideological opposites, and forged piece after piece of meaningful legislation on health care, labor law, and racial equality. Even a Republican president would praise him for his work on education.
He is a fabulous United States Senator. When he's against you, it's tough. When he's with you, it is a great experience.
As the last of the Kennedy brothers, he was the one who walked the nieces down the aisle, stood up for the nephews in trouble. And for the Kennedys, the trouble seemed endless. His own son lost a leg to cancer. His first wife went through an extended battle with alcoholism. Yet it was Ted Kennedy that the family rallied around when tragedy after tragedy struck. When John Kennedy Jr. died in a plane crash, it was Ted Kennedy who again spoke at yet another Kennedy funeral. Through it all, his love of politics sustained him. He was never happier than when he was on the stump, as he was this day when he campaigned for Barack Obama.
Our next President of the United States, Barack Obama!
Kennedy left his hospital bed against doctors' orders to fly cross-country and made a dramatic appearance for Obama at the Democratic National Convention.
The hope rises again, and the dream lives on.
He braved sub-freezing weather to see Obama sworn in as the nation's 44th president, but exhausted by the cold, he suffered a seizure at a Capitol lunch following the ceremony. It gave the assembled dignitaries a scare, and the new president was clearly shaken.
I would be lying to you if I did not say that right now a part of me is with him. And I think that's true for all of us. This is a joyous time, but it's also a sobering time.
6 weeks later, Kennedy was feeling well enough to attend a star-studded birthday celebration in Washington. With his wife Vicki at his side, he beamed as President Obama led the birthday song. Ted Kennedy never became president, but his legislative accomplishments leave a lasting mark on Washington and American life far greater than most of those who held the office he never won. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, Washington.